That is a crap ton of papers talking about all this stuff. I would love to know if there's some whys they can attach to it, like why most of the stuff has appeared, like what I was saying with the influence of the critical theory stuff starting in the 70s really prominently in academia. But yeah, I'd be curious to see what they could find. It's really curious and really kind of at times a little scary. So every so often, folks send me links to some interesting things, and this one's actually really, really fascinating data-wise. So it's Rozado's Visual Analytics, run by David Rozado, on Substack, and so it's another great place to subscribe if you're interested in science-related stuff on the internet. And this one's particularly interesting because it's about an interesting kind of idea to get into, and so one of the ways with social science that you can look at certain things like changes in different belief systems and, prevalence of topics, and the more topics are getting discussed, is just on frequency of words. Frequency of words in different topic areas and what have you. And so he's obviously got a link here to published articles and to a Twitter thread about it. But he has done some very interesting things here showing off the prevalence of different words and the change in prevalence of different words over time in newspapers. Whoopsie. Hang on. Change in the prevalence of different words. Sorry, we had a technical glitch for a moment. Change in the prevalence of different words over time, appearing in news media and in academic papers, and that's actually what this one is about. So he's talking about the academic literature and its increasing emphasis on prejudice and social justice. So what he's got right here is the fraction of total words in a year, and over fraction of total words in a year, and this is basically referencing, so the higher the line goes, the more frequently that word was used. More frequently that word was used in the current time. Percentage change in the frequency of that particular word. Blue is New York Times, red is Washington Post. And so you guys can see here for yourselves. Oh, there we go. We can blow it up a little bit. Look at that. You can see here for yourselves a little bit the notion that, okay, yeah, New York Times, Washington Post are using all of these words that might be considered woke slang at this point quite a lot more frequently. And the nice thing about focusing on something like the New York Times or the Washington Post is you're not having to deal with the issue of there's a proliferation of news media compared to 100, 200 years ago when both of these newspapers were founded. So they're long length record. So you can see how things have changed over time in things written in the article. And they've also got the Pearson correlation here, so the correlation between the New York Times and the Washington Post, and it is often, quite frequently, in the 90% range, or 0.9 if you will, if not close to 1 in some instances, how correlated they are. And this goes all the way to 1970 here, though you could go back further. So what he's going into in this one is summarizing in this particular field the prevalence of dynamics and prejudice denoting terms in 175 million academic papers, which, first off, bravo, that's a heck of a lot of studies to look through, published in all fields of knowledge. Like I said, that's a heck of a lot of studies to look through. So bravo. I give you that, because that is just one, that's what might be called a big data problem, because that is a lot of information to look through. Hence the usefulness of programming and what have you that's involved here, because you can scrape things off of websites using carefully constructed programming code and get to things like that. Obviously, I have no idea exactly how they did it here. I don't think it's described in this Substack article, though it might be in the longer one. But anyway, something of curious there. Something curious there. Pardon me. It's been a bit of a day. We quantify the prevalence of words denoting prejudice against ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, minority religious sentiment, age, body weight, and disability, and SSORC abstracts over the period 1970 to 2020. So 50 years. 50 years. And again, this has to do with the relative frequency of words. And basically, the higher the line goes here, the more frequently the word is used. So, and what you can see here is the other thing is he's got the ratio of 2020 to 1970. How much more frequently is the word used in 2020 than in 1970? And one of the things I love, and this is brilliant for this guy to do it, because sometimes it's very hard for academic literature, for anything approaching scientific literature, to crystallize it in a very clear way for someone. But this gentleman does a great job with visualizing, so I give lots of props on that front. But basically here, look carefully at this with the increase in frequency of discussion of the words. And why does this matter? Well, 1970s in particular, you can think about what was starting to happen in academia with the influence of things like critical legal studies and a lot of the critical studies getting into academia. And so it is no surprise to see that increasing trend from 1970s, because that was when there was the prevalence of that in the 1970s is just getting started. That's when a lot of this crazy stuff really got started in academia. And it followed from there. We next examine the relationship between the prevalence of terms denoting specific prejudice types in scholarly abstracts and the prevalence of those terms in news media written content. Often terms denoting a new prejudice type appear to emerge first in the academic literature and spread to news media. Exactly, because you're training everybody. You're training everybody in college, and then they go out into the real world, and you take it with them. This is why I harp on scientists. This is why I harp on higher education, because it is where we train scientists. And so the ideas you get absorbed in academia that are, pardon my language, bullshit, get thrown into the sciences too, unfortunately. In such is the case in 1970s for the prejudice types of homophobia and ageism. Similar dynamics occur for Islamophobia, ableism, and transphobia in later years. Fatphobia, however, displays the opposite dynamic, with pioneering occurrence happening first in news media and emergence in the academic literature happening afterwards. That's fascinating. I would not have called that. But yeah, so yeah, you look at this, what is it? The blue line is the scholarly articles. The dashed orange line is 25 million news articles: New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, New York Post, The Guardian, The Independent, The Times, The Telegraph, and The Daily Mail in here. So, can't quite get it all on the page here in the recorder, but this is certainly of interest itself. And so you can see it. Lots more prevalence in these things before you get to the amount of prevalence that you have now. And this is for the combined language: racism, racists, xenophobia, white supremacy, sexism, sexist, misogyny, patriarchy, discrimination. Look at how much more prevalence there is in the 1980s, 2000s, 2010s, until you get to 2010, and then it starts to show up like crazy here in the news media just as much. You can see for other things, it's kind of right along the same lines. I would wonder if they have an explanation for that, because some of these I could see becoming really prominent in sync with academia. Okay, how do I put this? I'm wondering if, because he's not wrong necessarily, that some ideas would be appearing first in academia and then trickle into the news media. But I wonder if that gap of time has slowed to the point where they almost overlap with the rise of social media and the instant information that can get out. I really wonder that. And I think some of this suggests that that's possible. Here. Let's see. We next apply factor analysis to derive common variability among all the time series of prejudice denoting terms in scholarly content and news media discourse. This was done to uncover underlying factors encapsulated in the raw time series data of each prejudice-denouncing term in both scholarly and news media content. A single factor, blue trend line in the figure below, encapsulates 56% of overall variance of the 25 prejudice-denoting terms in scholarly content. The factor displays a steady growth from the 1980s around the early 2010s and a marked increase post-2014. A single factor, dashed orange line, captures 71% of the overall variance of the 25 prejudice-denoting terms in news media articles. This factor appears very stable from 1970s until 2010, rather. Wow. And then displays an abrupt increase post-2010. So that's what they're talking about right here. So yeah, there's a single factor, 71% in news media and 56% in the academic articles, and becomes more and more important. That single factor becomes more and more important after you get to that. So it's the first factor. So it's basically like what is it that drives that variability? Of course, they don't say here, which is interesting. Underlying factors, they don't encapsulate. Yeah, they don't really say it. That's fascinating. That is fascinating. Let's see. Prevalence of social justice terms in scholarly literature. We examine the prevalence in academic abstracts of an additional set of terms often associated with social justice discourse. Frequency of terms denoting social justice discourse in 175 million scholarly abstracts. Again, really, really impressive. So, here you go. Again, this is 1970 to 2020. And almost all of these have been very steadily increasing over time, which again, to me, makes sense. Things like safe space and gender neutral and implicit bias. Actually, implicit bias is right here and has such a really marked increase over a very short period of time. Bias right here. Again, this is all about increase in frequency. So the higher to the top of each graphic, the more frequent it is. So that's how you can tell by the end of 2020, these are much more frequently used than before. This is interesting with the activism one, actually, that it comes off of a high, goes down, and then goes back up. I wonder if that's because that's coming off of the 1960s or something like that. But anyway, yeah. Factor analysis of the terms denoting social justice discourse in scholarly news media displays very similar patterns to those documented previously for factor analysis of prejudice denoting terms. The factor derived from scholarly content displays steady growth from 1980s to the early 2010s, at which point the rate of the growth of the factor increases substantially. In contrast, the factor derived from news media content is relatively stable from the 70s until 2013 and then grows abruptly. Yeah. So the green one here is the scholarly articles, and that explains 82% of the variance. And this orange one, again, is news articles, but it's 68% of the variance. Okay. Fascinating stuff. I'll have to go read the thing in depth, but let me put in the closing thoughts here. We have presented a pioneering analysis about the prevalence of terms denoting prejudice and social justice discourse in the academic literature and its concomitant prominence in news media content. Wow. Our results suggest that prevalence in academic literature of terms denoting prejudice and social justice discourse has been growing steadily and diffusely since the 1980s. This is mostly not the case in news media content, where the prevalence of such terminology stayed relatively flat from the 1970s until the early 2010s. Post-2010, both academic publishing and news media display an abrupt increase in the prevalence of prejudice and social justice discourse in their content, but the pattern appears to be more acute in news media. So, yeah, it's... One of the things that's missing here is what the heck the factor is. I need a little bit more than just say factor analysis here, but this is really fascinating to me in terms of looking at how often people are using the language. And one of the things I want to get at, I would love to see them figure out how to get at, is an analytic way to assess how that language definition has changed. Because these definitions do change. Quite frankly, they do change very easily. And that is a lot of the point of The critical social justice and the Marxist postmodern approach is that the definitions of words get to be fungible and can be changed. Well, definitions of words are changed in the postmodern thing, so that a lot of these don't necessarily mean exactly what everybody else thinks they mean. And that is tricky in and of itself. So I would be very curious to see if they can figure that out. But it's also, I don't know what the exact numbers here are, but oh my gosh. That is a crap ton of papers that are talking about this nonsense. That is a crap ton of papers talking about all this stuff. I would love to know if there's some whys they can attach to it, like why most of the stuff has appeared, like what I was saying with the influence of the critical theory stuff starting in the 70s really prominently in academia. But yeah, I'd be curious to see what they could find. It's really curious and really kind of at times a little scary. I don't know what to say with this one, but I think this is a good place to go look if you're looking for some visual analysis on these things. That's it for now. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, everybody.